And welcome to the 56th IATEFL International Conference in the flesh. It's wonderful to see old faces, new faces, recurring faces. Thank you very much for making this your professional home. I would like to introduce my fellow trustees in the Board of Trustees of the Association, and I'm going to start with our incoming president, Alexander Popovsky. Can I remind you, please, that tomorrow, Wednesday, at 1 o'clock, in the Ripley Suite in the Crown Plaza Hotel, we have our annual general meeting. This is the place where we communicate the state of the association, and we would like to see all of you there, please, to welcome our new president. So please make a point of stopping by and listening. Then we have our treasurer, the money lady, Bethany Cagnol. Our own Harry Potter, who makes anything seem simple, Sean Wilden, who's manning the Digicom. Judith Mader, who represents the SIGs on our board, so she's your voice in the Board of Trustees. Associates are also represented by Mrs. Jean Tuma. And our bravest member, our secretary, who keeps us all in line, Ross Wright. At this point, I would like to make a mention too that Ross is rotating off her role after 6 years of service tomorrow at the AGM. So I think we all should give Ross a huge thank you for these 6 years of service. And unfortunately, our membership representative cannot be here with us. Moitza Belak had a slight accident that impaired her from traveling, but I know that she's going to be watching, and she's also rotating off the board tomorrow. So for this wonderful 6 years of service to the membership of our association, can we give Moitza a huge big thanks. You know, these have not been easy years for any association. If you have been watching UK TV these past few days, at least since I arrived, I was surprised to see how many charities are asking the public to donate £3, £2, from Save the Bears to Feed the Children. And we are a charity as well. We have navigated 2 extremely difficult years, and I think that we should also give a big thanks to our Chief Executive Officer and the head office staff. We have an association thanks to the work of the trustees and the people in head office, so please give them a hand. And when it comes to professional associations, there are 2 aspects to them. One is the management, the other one is the leadership. And with a colleague who's somewhere here, Marina Gonzalez, we've been exploring the dual roles of leaders and managers in professional associations. And we came to the realization that while management could be what head office staff do, leadership is supposed to be what the Board of Trustees does, and it's not quite so in our association. We are a very democratic association. We have membership representatives, SIG representatives, we have associate representatives. And as a parting thought, I would like to leave you with this. Leadership does not reside on the Board of Trustees. We are, at best, an interface between the leadership of the association and the management. And the leadership of the association lies with you guys. Because at one point or another, we were all sitting where you guys are sitting today. And it was through the mentoring, the nurturing of like-minded colleagues that we committed to volunteering more and more. So we expect that you guys have the same experience and that the leaders of the future are here. I also want to give a big shout out to past presidents. Our association is what it is, thanks to those who are here. And I can see Harry and Marjorie, and I know we have Herbert, and I don't want to miss everybody. So a big hand to our past presidents. Adrian, Alan. And a conference of these dimensions is not possible without the generous support of some of our sponsors. I want to highlight two of our sponsors today, and I want to invite you to attend their events. First of all, a big thank you to Express Publishing. We are all going to be drinking from their wisdom literally in the very practical recyclable cups. They have a wonderful signature event today at 17:20 in Hall D here in the conference center. The title is To Act or Not to Act. And please don't forget to visit them in their stand. Their stand is number 36 in the exhibit hall in the ground floor, in the basement actually. And then the sponsor of our tote bags, ETS TOEFL, they have a wonderful pop-up presentation later today at 16:15. The TOEFL family of assessments for learners of all ages are also found in our exhibit hall, and their stand is 37. Easy to remember, Express Publishing 36, TOEFL 37, visit one, visit both. And the last thing I want to do today is to highlight the emerging talent in our association. In the first row here, we have our scholarship winners. Wait a minute, there. Can I ask you please to stand up and be acknowledged by your peers? You are the ones driving the SIGs and the innovation. And before passing on the baton to Ross, I cannot be remiss to mention how happy we are to have our patron, Dr. David Crystal, with us again in the flesh. And I ask you to please stop by the exhibit hall today at noon and on Thursday at noon. David is stepping down after 30 years of service as patron to our association. So please stop by and say thank you for 30 years of support. Thank you very much, David. And now, to what gathered us here today. Ross Wright is going to introduce our first plenary of the day.
Hello, good morning. Before I do announce our first plenary speaker to open the conference this year, I just have a message for those of you who are not yet, and I reiterate the word yet, members of IATEFL, in the sense that we have a special offer at the moment. So if you are not yet a member of IATEFL and you want to join, there is a special offer at the moment, and for the same price as for 12 months, we will offer you a membership of 15 months. So along with that, with all your CPD, ways of sort of developing your CPD, through IATEFL, through all the events that we offer, both online and face-to-face, as well as discounts, etc. I think that you'll find that that is a really, really generous and beneficial offer. So do take that up. If you want to know more about that, go over to the IATEFL stand or to the registration desk, and somebody will help you with that. Okay. So I do want to introduce our first plenary speaker. And in fact, there are very few people in the world of ESP and Business English who don't know the name Evan Frendo. But for those of you who don't, let me just give you a little bit of insight into his background. So Evan's first teaching job was not actually an ELT. Believe it or not, his first teaching job was as a rock climbing instructor for the British Army. Yes, you heard right. He tells me that where he learned his main objective of every lesson was to not kill people, okay? And he tells me, I have it on good authority, that he follows that principle today and has maintained a 100% record of survivability. I think that's good to know, right? So Evan started his career in ELT in 1993, yeah? And has spent the last 30 or so years working mainly in corporate training, while also picking up a master's degree in ESP along the way. But like so many of us, his career has been eclectic, and his roles have included full-time working for several years, both as trainer and teacher trainer for Siemens in Germany. He's been a chief examiner for LCCI for the English for Accounting exam, and a visiting professor at a couple of universities in China. He's done lots of other work as well in maritime English. He's been a coursebook writer, and he's also stood where I stand today as IATEFL secretary. And he's currently one of our IATEFL ambassadors, okay? But he's probably best known in ELT for a book entitled How to Teach Business English, which arrived on the scene about 20 years ago, but is still entirely applicable and is a book that is used on many teacher training courses across the world. He sees himself very much as a practitioner and working outside of academia, and that's where he's going to be drawing his experience today from English for the Workplace. So it gives me immense pleasure to welcome to the stage for the very, very first plenary session on ESP and Business English, English for the Workplace, our friend and colleague, Evan Frendo.
Good morning, everybody. So nice to be here, and so nice to have a business English, workplace English plenary talk. But I guess it's not that surprising, really, because everybody here probably has students, learners who, if not in the workplace as adults, are probably preparing for the workplace and will probably use English at some point. This talk was inspired by this gentleman here, Einstein. And it's a lovely anecdote. You might have read it in the abstract. And Einstein was a professor, as you probably know, in a university, and he set a test one year. And his assistant said, "Excuse me, Professor," he was quite well known for being absent-minded. He said, "You gave them this test last year." And Einstein said, "Yes, I gave them the test last year, but this year the answers are different." And I thought that's exactly such an inspirational talk, I think, or a theme for a talk, because of course that's exactly where we are with English for the Workplace, a lot of our teaching world, where things are changing so fast. Things have always changed, but things are changing so fast. The basic job remains the same, in my case, to make people more effective at their jobs when they're using English. But how we do it has changed and is changing. And what I want to do in this session really is just give you some insights into my world of teaching English for the workplace. We'll dip into various people and different people's perspectives. You may agree with some, you may disagree with many, and just think about some of the issues. So you may be familiar with, this is one of the earlier English for the Workplace schools. This is the Henry Ford School, or Ford English School. 1914 started. Henry Ford, as you probably know, ran car factories in the States, and he needed workers, and most of his workers were immigrant workers. And so he had to pull these people in, and none of them, or very few of them, spoke English. So he had to set up an English school in his factories to train people. And this is the famous melting pot, which you may have heard of. And the idea was, at the end of the English course, the immigrants climbed into the melting pot on the other side of what you can see there, wearing their national costume, inside the melting pot, they changed into American clothing, and they came out on this side waving an American flag as American citizens now able to speak English. Isn't that wonderful? Of course, things have changed. We don't really do this anymore in workplace English teaching, or I haven't gotten away with it. But it's interesting to see that, this has been around. I'm writing, or I've been sharing or helping a colleague in China write a book, and one of the chapters is called Business English Teaching in the Qin Dynasty. So, this is a very, it's an area of English teaching which has been around for a very long time. So what I'm going to do basically is divide this talk into 3 parts. The first thing I want to do is just talk a little bit about what is English for the workplace. We'll be looking at different sectors of business, of industries, just trying to get a feel for what it actually means to be in the workplace using English. Because really that's the target of what we're all trying to do in a way. And then I'll move on and look at the perspective from outside our world of ELT. And we'll look at what learning and development people are saying, and HR people in companies are saying, and what business people are saying about the way they see English and how people learn in the workplace and how people learn in the modern workplace. And then I'll finish off with 5 or 10 minutes maybe on so what? What does this mean for us? Does it mean that we're becoming less relevant, or how can we remain relevant, or what do we need to do to become more relevant? So these are the sorts of issues I'll be talking about. Ros mentioned that I've been working quite a lot in maritime English for the last few years, quite a lot. Before COVID, I used to fly to South Korea quite regularly. I live in Germany. But that's only one of the sectors I have worked in over 30 years. You get to move around quite a lot. But I want to talk a little bit about maritime English first, because I've got a couple of examples I think you might be interested in. Maritime English is a huge area. I mean, it's a big business. At any one time, there's 50, 60,000 ships at sea carrying the goods that you and I like to go and buy in the streets in between the sessions at conferences like this. Ships like this. Not many people on these vessels, but it's a big industry. That's only one part of maritime English. There's a huge thing behind all the shipping, of course. There's the people who never go to sea, but on shore doing all the jobs, building the ships, fixing the ships, and so on. So it's a big industry. What I want to talk about is, first, is the vessel traffic service, which is where I've been working specifically. VTS, Vessel Traffic Service. Now, this is a part of the maritime industry, a bit like air traffic control. These are the people who, when a vessel arrives at a port, they speak on the radio. They still speak, soon it'll be done by computer, but they speak on the radio to somebody sitting in a tower and who guides them in, tells them where to go, deals with emergencies, all sorts of things, just like air traffic control. And I'll play you a short recording. We built up a huge corpus they built up a huge corpus which I used of many of these radio conversations, and the idea was to analyze them, and we spent a lot of time listening to these conversations, analyzing them, trying to find the miscommunication so that we could train people better in the future. This is very much what workplace language training is all about, trying to really understand the language being used. So I'm going to play this excerpt, and as I do, just think, if you were the English teacher, or if these were your people, or what would you do? How would you think about training these people? What could you do to help? So here's the text. Let's see if the audio works.
There is one small vessel non-stern which capsized. Over. One small boat on the astern. Okay, thank you. And I can see that there is also another one boat now rendering assistance. She's rescuing the crew on board of the capsized vessel.
Okay, please rescue the crew and please find the people over.
Roger will keep an eye on them because there is another one small boat also picking up the crew. Bunker George, California.
When I first started working with VTS, I listened to lots of conversations like this, and I thought, shit, how can these people even understand what they're saying to each other? But they do. You know, these vessels come in and out of these harbors every 5 or 10 minutes, massive, massive vessels, and none of them are native speakers of English, for want of a better description, or very few of them are. The VTS people never know what accent is going to come at them. There is a sort of rule about knowing some English, but it's fairly vague and not really that precise. And of course, some ships have better speakers than others, and you just have to deal with it, you know. And this really is an example of workplace English. These are users of English, these are not learners of English. They operate at the level they have. They're using English as a lingua franca to get the job done. And if you notice this, I mean, you might say, well, there's a little bit of jargon, but actually most of it we can understand as English speakers. But it is very, very context specific, and it's very situation specific. And it's this sort of thing, this sort of challenge, which really hits people when they go and use English in the workplace. It's always context specific. It never looks like the stuff in the course books. It's never like those role plays they did at university. You know, it's real money, real people, real stress, and all the rest of it. I mentioned we built a corpus, and of course the corpus, a lot of it was the standard stuff. You know, you very rarely get exciting things like people going overboard and having to pick them out of the water. And these are the sorts of things which are very, very common. You know, where do I park my ship, Mr. VTS? You know, but what's really interesting, coming from a teaching perspective, is how non-standard so many of the utterances are. You know, we are dropped anchor because bad weather. Good morning. Where drop anchor? My drop anchor time 2050 local time. I'd like to heave up my anchor and reposition my anchor because now my anchor is stretching. That's actually a technical word, that's okay. I finally anchor away over, you know, and the corpus is full of stuff like this. And it works, and nobody worries about it. But it probably wouldn't pass one of our exams, if you see what I mean. Or you wouldn't get a very high grade. And so what's really interesting, as soon as you get into the workplace, the criteria for communication is completely different. What is successful communication is not grammar and you know, traditional stuff we tend to look at, because we can, perhaps. It's much more performance-based. Now, I mentioned lingua franca, and I'll be talking about lingua franca later. And I have been, you know, told by people in standardized testing, for example, oh, you're one of those people who doesn't care about grammar. That's not the position of lingua franca at all. That's certainly not the position of lingua franca research. But the grammar is a little bit more flexible than say, standard grammar in a UK textbook or in an American textbook or whatever. What about other jobs aboard a vessel? This is a course book I was involved in writing. I'll make it bigger so you can see it. Now, on every vessel, you'll have a crew, 10, 15, 20 people, and you'll have a captain from Norway, and you'll have a bosun from, I don't know, maybe China, and you'll have some crew from the Philippines, and you might have the engine room people all come from Indonesia, and they come on board for a voyage or 2 or 3 voyages. They don't know each other beforehand. You know, they just get an instruction, go to this berth, go on your ship, and it leaves in 20 minutes after you arrive, sort of thing. And this is the reality that these people live in, you know, and not everybody is university educated. A lot of the people in our industry are the haves of the world. They have the luxury of a good education, and we can give them nice English lessons at university or at school. But a lot of the world are the have-nots in terms of education. And I think this is an area where it's massively under, I don't know, looked after, I guess. But certainly, when you go on board a vessel, not everybody has good English competence, but they still have to do their job, and they find a way to do it. And I've talked about maritime, but of course it's in industry after industry after industry. I put this up because it's one of my favorite titles of an academic article, doing the funky chicken to communicate on multinational projects. I think that's great, but the article looks at how people actually communicate when their English isn't very good, you know. And of course, like in maritime, like in oil and gas, like in so many industries, mistakes can kill people. Construction, very much so. And so this article explains how in one case the foreman says, yes, to communicate we have to do the funky chicken dance. And it was good because I could use AI to produce my first presentation picture, so I've now used AI at a presentation. But this is the reality. And when you start reading this sort of stuff, what you come across is terms like language brokering. You may know this term. It's very common when you're talking about immigrants, for example, where an immigrant comes into a new country and the children learn the language of the country, but the parents can't speak it. So when the parents have to go to the doctor or the dentist or whatever, the child comes along to do the translation. That's called language brokering. But of course, in the workplace, language brokering is everywhere. There are research articles which look at how, on construction sites, teams are designed so that each team has one language broker who can interpret for the rest of the team, for example. Very, very common in the tourism industry. Very, very common in health, in medical. So, you know, these are things which people in the workplace are doing all the time. They're just having to use English in order to do something. I worked in the oil and gas industry for a couple of years. I last a couple of years and then they asked me to move on normally. But this is a pipe, oil and gas. And of course, pipes get full of deposits, they call them. And so you have something called a pipeline inspection gauge, which comes along and cleans the pipes. They're called pigs in the industry. You may recognize it if you like James Bond. James Bond, I think, is in 3 different films. He gets in one of these to either get into a country or get out of a country. So they're pretty big machines. But the beautiful thing, if you're an English teacher and you meet this for the first time in your class, is you find out that pig is a verb. Have you pigged the pipe? Oh, we pigged it yesterday. When are you going to pig it? You know, all these terms which, as an English teacher, you might not be familiar with, but the jargon of a particular technical industry or anything, all of them have their own words which you have to get to know and love. The thing which made me really love this term is that these things are made of metal and they're going down metal pipes, so they squeal as they go down the pipe. I mean, you just can't make this stuff up, you know, it's fantastic. But of course, it's not, English for the workplace is not only for people who work on construction sites and maritime and haven't got an education. There are plenty of people in our business who are very highly educated. If you go into the financial industry, for example, you may be familiar with earnings calls, you know, when you're checking your investments. Most teachers have lots of stocks and shares to check. But if you go in, you can find these online. There are hundreds and hundreds of thousands probably available online. And what they are is companies come online and they say what they've been doing and they talk about plans for the future, and then the investors have a Q&A session. Yeah? These are online. Very often the transcripts are there. They're lovely. If you're into business English in a general sense and want to talk about things like stocks and shares, they're actually a very, very useful source, and they're all there. Now, I've used these things with some classes where it was appropriate, and in one group, somebody came up. What we did was we said, okay, everybody get in small groups. You know, you have to do that if you're an English teacher, get in groups. And everybody had a couple of transcriptions to look at, and then they would come back and we would talk about interesting language they had found. And one of them was color. Teacher, this is different meaning of color. And so we looked at this and we found that almost every transcript, every conversation on these earnings calls seems to have this word color, spelt in a strange way if you come from England, but it's okay. And you know, any color there would be helpful, to add a little more color. I have no real color to add. This is not the color meaning that you find in the dictionary. It seems to be some sort of request for additional information. So, you know, appreciate the color. You know, if somebody said that to me, normally I wouldn't have understood it. But in this context, this seems to be, it seems to have picked up this meaning. And this is another aspect of course, all English, but certainly workplace English. communities, groups of people start using language in a certain way. I haven't seen this in other places, maybe you have. I've certainly asked lots of colleagues and they've said, no, color doesn't mean that at all. What are you talking about? Until I show them the evidence. So, you know, there's a lot going on in this workplace English. We'll look at a couple of excerpts from meetings just to think about some of the other issues I come across. Of course, we already saw in the maritime conversations that there is non-standard English. That's fine. I used the before reference. This is from international meetings. So groups of people from all over the world, could be online, could be face-to-face. They're happening all the time. Every company you go to now does these things, these team meetings, and the meeting scripts are full of words like this. I use the before reference. I ask for a quick glance for this paragraph. Okay, I note it. We will think later on. I love that. Any idea where it is? Can I get back to you later? I need more thoughts for that. Wonderful. I would like listen comments from experts here. None of this stops communication. Almost all of them would be given a lower grade on many of the exams we have to deal with. I've used the word native speaker here. I don't like it. None of us like using this word anymore, but it's still a description, and it certainly seems to work in these. And very often you get a native speaker who thinks the meeting is in their language. They tend to dominate, and there's lots of research to show that this happens. And they use sentences, utterances like this, you know, I don't want to grapple with. I think we should go the whole hog. All the other guff. Do we really want to be down in the weeds? You've hit the nail on the head. And look at this one. It sort of knocks the nail on the head out of sight. You know, and I sit there and, I don't know, some Australian or American or Brit has said something like this. And they just plow on and they move at a different speed to everyone else. I'm sure a lot of the people in this room know exactly what I'm talking about. It's irritating. I'm not saying all native speakers do this. Of course, plenty of people are very, very good international speakers. But this is an issue. And more in my business, certainly, native speakers come to our sessions now because they realize that their target is not the English they grew up with. It's international English. It's English for the workplace. But very often when I sit on these meetings, I'm either taking part, but more often I'm sitting in the background coaching. So if it's online, I might be chatting to my own clients. Sometimes I'm in the room and they're texting me, or we have a session afterwards and we just discuss where the difficulties were. And I have hundreds of comments like this. I've only got 4 here to show you. I cannot get the point. You know, Evan, we're struggling with the expressions, they say. Native speakers always win, but implementation issue will be for non-native speakers. You know, that came from the heart. Those people actually left the project after that meeting. And my favorite sentence, I have become one crazy lady from Asia. Isn't that wonderful? That came straight from her heart. She was so, and her English was really good. I mean, really very good. But, you know, the level of communication and the way the communication was working was not appropriate for an international lingua franca type of English use. Which brings me on to one of my favorite topics, BELF, English as a business lingua franca. Being researched quite a lot now for the last 10, 15, 20 years. Of course, we're probably all familiar with ELF. English as a business lingua franca is just really looking at it in terms of a workplace type of context. And the research articles are full. I mean, half the people in this room have probably written some of these articles. I'm looking for certain people. But, you know, conformity with standard English is seen as a fairly irrelevant concept, says one German manager in a multinational. I don't actually care whether something is correct or incorrect as long as the meaning is not distorted. So we find a lot of these sorts of comments in the literature. People in the workplace are really not worried about the things that drive our standardized tests very often. Now, I know things have moved in standardized tests and it's not only about right and wrong, but, you know, they're in a slightly different place to where most people in our industry are, I think. Lots of definitions about BELF. This is one of my favorites. BELF is perceived as an enabling resource to get the work done. That's all it is. It's a tool. Since it is highly context-bound and situation-specific, it is a moving target, defying detailed linguistic description. Now, this is really tricky because, of course, our whole profession, in a way, depends on having that linguistic description to teach people, and we have to give them something. I mean, you know, you have to have the basics, you have to have some sort of core of the language in order to communicate with other people. And this huge discussion we're having in our profession is really quite a hard one to meet both sides of the argument, as it were. But of course, detailed linguistic description is exactly what I was trying to do with that corpus with the VTS people, for example. We're trying to analyze the language to find out what the language is like. So when we go into workplace language teaching, teaching workplace English, the normal thing is something like this, and we'll probably all be fairly familiar with this sort of idea. We have a needs analysis. It leads to some sort of course design. There's some sort of course delivery. And then we have assessment, maybe some test or something like that, and maybe evaluation of the course. Now, I know it doesn't go around in a nice linear pattern like this. I mean, we all know this. There's lots of variations on this. But, you know, you look at any How to Be an ESP Teacher book, and you will get something like this in Chapter 1. And it's very much the basics of how the English for Specific world works, more or less. There's lots of variations on it, I know, but it is a bit like this. And the point I'm making is that it's quite structured. It is a bit top-down. You know, you go into a university class, and the teacher doesn't normally say, right, guys, what shall we do today? The students sort of expect the teacher to have some sort of idea about what they're going to do. There might be some materials. It might be task-based. Whatever is happening, somebody has thought about it normally. And it's normally the teacher as the expert in most educational institutes. I know it's not always the case, and I'm sure there's lots of exceptions here, but that's traditionally how we've played this. Does this still work? Well, one of the problems, of course, comes with this word proficiency, which we all know and love. And this is the CFR, one of the lines about proficiency. It's all about can-do statements now in CFR, as we all know, and that's been very, very influential. But is it looking at the can-do stuff that the VTS operator has to do, or the oil and gas guy has to do, or the construction site has to do? Or is it some sort of other proficiency? How much is the proficiency we look at and think about related to actual job performance? Tricky area. Let's look at an example from aviation. Some of the people in this room may be familiar with this research. Kim from Korea, he's written several really interesting articles about this. But in this one, they had I think, 17-minute extract, recorded conversation between a Russian pilot and a Korean air traffic controller. So not maritime aviation. So it's actually quite strict, and most people have to pass exams in order to do this. But they gave this conversation to 3 pilots and 3 air traffic controllers to comment on, not English teachers. And in this particular analysis, what they found was that although the Russian pilot was viewed as having limited English proficiency, the strategies he used to make himself understood were evaluated positively as fulfilling the requirements of the professional role. By contrast, the Korean air traffic controller, although not evaluated as having limited proficiency, was criticized for his lack of professional knowledge. In other words, what we're looking at as teachers in our world is a little bit different to what the insiders are looking at. And this is probably one of the main themes of this talk. You know, are we actually focused on the right things? Are we really doing our clients, our students, a favor by focusing on what we do focus on? Now, it is changing. Ros will recognize this. I think she was one of the developers of this. The OET has become very well known, very successful around the world. It's looking at medical English, health industry, various exams for different parts. But it's not based on linguistic criteria alone. And I think it's probably quite groundbreaking in its time. Ross, is it groundbreaking? It's groundbreaking, official. But what's interesting about this, it has linguistic criteria, which is the standard stuff we all know and love. But this one says, okay, we're going to have to look at quite different criteria set up by people inside the industry. So in the clinical communication criteria, for example, I just pulled out a couple of examples. In relationship building, you have criteria like an attentive and respectful attitude. You know, that's not normally part of a criteria to pass a language test. It's certainly not one my wife has ever passed, anyway. Adopting a non-judgmental approach. Actually, this is written for my wife, I just realized this. Showing empathy for feelings. Yeah. I hope she never watches this YouTube video. Listing and exploring. This is from understanding and incorporating the the patient's perspective, eliciting and exploring the patient's ideas, concerns, expectations, picking up patient's cues. You know, this is wonderful stuff. And in a way, when you look at this stuff and the way our big tests are going, you think, why hasn't this been done before? And of course, there are plenty of reasons why it hasn't been done before. But certainly in the workplace, this sort of test is now attracting a lot of attention. Now, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of space still for the big standardized tests. You know, if I work in a company in, I don't know, in Korea or in Taiwan somewhere, and I need to test 20,000 people, then, you know, a big standardized test is going to give me a rough idea of whether or not they know a little bit of English. But it doesn't tell me very much about whether or not they can do the job in English. And this is a huge problem. I'll never forget that Ross mentioned I worked in a Siemens factory for a few years. And I'll never forget, in my first year, I was working in a factory which made gas turbines. And I got a phone call from the boss of the factory who said, look, we're sending somebody up. Can you please tell me if I can send him to Japan next year to next week to do a negotiation on this stuff? And, you know, I mean, it was my responsibility to say yes or no. And I could judge his English, but how to judge if he could do his job in English? Very, very tricky. Okay, in that case, I had an engineering degree, so I could ask some of the right questions, but I wasn't a gas turbine expert, you know, and it was very much, this is a bit hit and miss, and that's what I told the boss, and he said, well, you're the English teacher, tell me, you know. And that's the reality. In the workplace, there's a job to do, and people need to know if people can do the job in English, not whether or not they can pass a test. In the VTS part, which is the area I've been working in, the assessment is now carried out by a team. You have the English teacher. In the past, it was always the English teacher who passed the English test. But now you have 3 people in the team. You have an experienced VTS operator, so somebody who's been doing it for 20 years, who listens to the role plays in the exam, in the test, and says, yes, you did the right thing. That was absolutely what you should have done in that situation to save a life or to tell that vessel what to do or how to control, you know, a situation. But you also have a legal expert because, of course, what happens on the radio, every single conversation is recorded for forever. And if you make mistakes, it can have legal consequences for your government. And so they now have a legal expert sitting in on these tests to say, yes, he may have done the correct technical stuff in saving the ship and he may have used the right English, but he broke the law doing it. And this is really tricky because this is workplace English at its finest in a way. You know, this is where we are. How do we judge if somebody can do the job? So hopefully now everybody has an idea of what I think I mean by workplace English. As you can see, I'm talking about pretty specific stuff because I think from my experience anyway, as soon as you get into the workplace, it's very context specific. It's never general. It's never course book, you know, general comment stuff. It's always very, very specific, very task based on what they're doing. So what is the perspective from outside our industry? And this is me looking very nervous in front of, I think there were about 10 Koreans sitting in a U like this, you know, and they were listening to my presentation on why they should hire me as an overseas consultant. And I'd had the lovely Korean food the night before, and I wanted this job because Korean food is really nice. But anyway, it was a fairly high stress interview. Yeah, so if we look at it, now let's forget about English teaching for a while. We'll come back to that, obviously, that's why we're here. But let's think of it in terms of learning and development or HR or whoever is responsible in the company for this side of life. In other words, training people, developing people, the whole learning game. And this is a very recent book, but it sort of sums up quite a lot about what's happening in modern learning and the mindset that we're going into. Now, I know very much that this can sometimes appear quite a Western approach, and if you go and speak to somebody in China, it might be a bit different, and if you go and speak to somebody in India, it might be, of course, there are variations all around the world. But a lot of the companies we work with are global. The teams are composed of people from all over the world, and these big international companies are all moving towards this sort of mindset. Learning is becoming part of the workflow. It's not something you do separate. You don't go on an English course or a something else course unless there's no other way of doing it. Of course, people still do that, but it's coming more and more part of what's happening at work. these learning managers are trying to make use of the whole ecosystem, what's available to them to help somebody learn. They're not only looking at hiring a trainer. You know, when I started in the 90s, I spent a lot of time in hotels, 10 days on a negotiations course, or 10 days on this, or 10 days on that. Wonderful life for several years. And then the courses went down to 7 days, and then 4 days, and now it's all on Zoom. And, and life has changed quite a lot. But, you know, life changes, and the ecosystem is being used more and more. We're using the data a lot more. These people have got so much data about what learning is going on, and so they use this data to make key decisions. They're not basing their evidence, they're not basing it all on intuition like they may have in the past. Personalization, of course, we all know that's a huge thing, but in a company, you're talking about personalization at scale. And that seems to be, you know, a sort of contradiction, because making it personal makes it unique to one person, but you're trying to do it for 20,000 people. How do we do that? Every company will say learning and development has to deal direct with the business impact. Of course it does. Otherwise, why would they? I mean, that's why they're there, to do business. That's the whole point of life, as it were. And then there's this whole word agility, which you find over and over again. It came from IT originally, agile, and agility is in every conversation about every company you go into. How can we react to things which are changing so fast? You can no longer plan. You know, in the old days, you used to be able to go in and ask for an organigram of a company. Now, they don't even know who's in the company because it's changing so fast. They don't even know who's going to be on their project team tomorrow. You know, things are really moving fast, and agility is a key word in the real workplace. This is Duncan Bulting. He's a young project manager at Systematic, which is an IT company, 1,000-odd people, based in Denmark, but now with offices all over the world. He manages the German he partly manages the German team. And he said to me, and I wrote to several people preparing for this talk, and we'll see some of what people said to me from companies. We don't really do formal English training in the company. English teacher. Yes, we are international, and yes, people need to know English. Yes, some people arrive with very poor English skills, but I have found that they learn it relatively quickly by themselves because they need and use it daily at work. They are very motivated. We do not need to organize anything. Now, this is, of course, quite an extreme perspective of where we are with language training, but clearly, in his case, he speaks good English. The team comes in, he hires people because he's desperate for people. Every company in the world is desperate to hire the right people at the moment, and English is not really a factor. He knows they will learn it because they will use it all the time. And that's his story, his reality. Here's another one. This is Kasia from, she lives in Warsaw now. Some of us may know her. She used to come to IATEFL years ago. She used to be in this business, but she's moved on. And now she's a cluster training manager at Electrolux. Electrolux, big company, worldwide, been around over 100 years, doing all sorts of things. You can go into their websites if you want to know more about the companies. But she knows the ELT industry, and look what she says. From my experience, the days when English was taught in companies are gone. Central Eastern Europe, Europe, Middle East, Africa, and South America included. In other words, this is not a European thing in her. You know, she's handling teams around the world, and this is her experience. International companies release, for example, product service specifications, brand booklets, marketing materials in English, and cluster staff just has to be able to understand and use them. When recruited, people need to have the expected B2 level, otherwise they won't qualify for the job. This is different to the Duncan one, which is they hire anybody they can, and then somehow they learn on the job. So they actually try and recruit with a certain language level. But look, when on board, they are offered opportunities to polish off their language skills, B2, B2+ levels, but these are optional programs. Very often, depending on the decision maker, is the person doing the learning. And practically all the in-company jargon has to be learned on the go anyway. You don't learn that in the classroom because the teacher doesn't know it. How can the teacher know it?
Sorry, we've got a bit of an emergency. Can we just stand aside for a second?
I'm so sorry.
No, that's okay.
Sorry to
No
interrupt. We have a lady outside who needs a bit of help. I believe her colleague is in the third row here, Ellen Keats. Could you please go and help your colleague? I'm so sorry to interrupt.
Thank you.
was planned because I don't have enough to fill 50 minutes. So, yeah, so these are optional programs. Everything learned on the go anyway. And she says, in a nutshell, English is nowadays taken for granted, just like, for example, operational knowledge of Microsoft Office. So this is one end of the perspective from companies. So Duncan and Kasia, who are saying, yeah, actually, we don't do a lot of training in the company. And these are big global players. If you look at the World Economic Forum, they do a lot of research about this sort of thing. And this line really stood out to me when I read it. 94% of business leaders report that they expect employees to pick up new skills on the job. A sharp uptake from 65% in 2018. You know, so clearly this is something from COVID or the whole pandemic. But wow, you know, 94% expect people just to learn on the job. Now, this is not only English. This could be any skills they need. But that puts a bit of perspective on our whole profession, I think. Now, when we look at our own research in this area, Belf people again, Belf, workplace learning, this is the sort of thing people are saying. This is Susanna Ehrenreich. We saw bits from those managers she interviewed in the multinational company. This is one of the things she says. Learning, this is what she said in 2010 when she did this research. Actually, she probably did the research in 28 or something. Anyway, learning seems to happen most effectively in business communities of practice rather than in traditional English training. You know, that's our job, traditional English training. And people learn on the go in the communities of practice they work with. The other one, Miyuki Takino, is in Japan, and she did a whole really interesting article. I recommend this article on how people become users of English. Remember, I use this word users as opposed to learners. And her research in Japan showed, I illustrated how heavily their learning was sourced from their own experience of using English at work rather than from a systematic study of English. So this is the sort of thing that's happening. It's not everybody, but it is happening. This is informal learning. This is really what we're talking about in a way. Some of us may recognize the lady in the picture. All these things are happening around our learners, our students, our users of English, but at rates, at speeds, which was unheard of even 10 years ago. Informal learning has changed from 10 years ago. All these things are happening. Look at just translation apps, for example. If you've ever used something like Microsoft Teams, and somebody in the room only speaks German, and the rest of you speak English, and it translates perfectly well as he's talking or she's talking, and it's adjusting the sentence as he finishes the sentence, because it's using AI magic and all the rest of it. But this is amazing, and it was unthinkable even a few years ago. But what a fantastic way to learn a language, you know? Or these translation apps we're using, for example, when we write an email. A few years ago, I would write an email in German. My German is not very good, but I would have it checked by somebody. Now, I can just write it in DeepL or in one of the translation programs. It's pretty good, and my German is good enough maybe just to flick through and say, yes, that's roughly what I want to, and I can press send, and I don't have to annoy anybody else. But it's a fantastic learning opportunity, because when I do that process, I'm learning or improving my German. And there's no teacher involved, there's nobody involved, nobody's being paid for this, you know, it's all happening on the side. Micro-learning, this is another huge word. Any HR conference you go to is all about micro-learning nowadays, yeah, and it's happening in us with people like Duolingo and many, many others, you know. 10 minutes of language learning on the train before you get to work, 10 minutes while you go to the loo. I don't know, whatever people do, you know. But micro-learning, it's in these very small bite-sized chunks, and it is happening. People are doing it. It's not only learning on the job, it's happening everywhere, absolutely everywhere. Here's a short video. Volkswagen, big German company, one of the biggest car producers in the world. This is what's called an MVP, minimum viable product. So this is a game. I'm going to press a button and you'll see the video in a minute, a 1-minute video. But it's a gamification. It's an example of micro-learning through gamification. And it's still being developed. They may adopt it, they may not. It's still very early stage. So this is a bit rough and ready. But have a look at this and see what you think. music was for the Italians in the room. Um, but the point about this is that it's a game. People have to deliver pizzas. They use the latest Volkswagen products to do it. And they learn surreptitiously, as it were. To get the pizza there faster and so on, they have to learn which e-product do I use, which e-vehicle, electric vehicle. So it's a way of training the people who work at Volkswagen about the new products, and they, of course, learn the stuff very well. But it's fun. This is the sort of thing, it's full of little tweaks like this. And so after you've played it a few times, you get to know all the products. But it's surreptitious. People aren't really officially being trained. They call it a serious game. It won an award last year in e-learning award. But a serious game, Pizza Blast. Very, very successful. Lots of people like it. It's fun to play, all the rest of it. Big player, Volkswagen. Will they adopt it? We don't know. What was interesting was I went up to the guy and I said, hey, this is brilliant because people are learning surreptitiously and they're learning English. He said, that's a good idea. He hadn't even thought about it from a language learning perspective, but, people are using that in their everyday learning experience, and they're not even thinking about learning English, but they're using English to do it, and this is where we're going. Some people call this a learning cluster. This idea that we surround the learners with meaningful learning assets. How about that? That's a good sentence. If it was one word, it could go into your box serve. It's not one word. Instead of designing one training program per capability gap, in other words, the old way, L&D needs to shift to designing multiple assets and connecting learners with the learning assets they need. So this is where L&D sees itself going. It's no longer organizing courses for people. It's doing something else. I'll show you some examples. One of the things, Owens and Kadakia, this has become quite influential, this model. They've said, okay, so there are three learning touch points. These are places, it comes from marketing, it's where the customer touches the product, and in this case, where learners come into contact with the learning contact. And they say, okay, so there's the traditional formal training, which we all know and love, organize an intensive course, extensive course, or whatever. There's immediate, which is in the moment of need. So somebody who needs something for a particular project, a particular meeting, can find it straight away. Or there's a social thing, this whole idea of talking to people, either online or face-to-face, and learning through interaction. And I'll give you an example of this. This is Nadzea. You may know her if you are in BSIC. This comes from a talk she gave at the last BSIC conference last November, one of the best talks I've ever been to, and she gave example after example after example of how she's doing this in her company. And so you've got formal. This is about project interviews. So in her company, big company, EPAM systems all over the world, project interviews are where you interview a client to work on a project together, IT. So you have normal formal training, as we've all known and loved for years. She then has to have these immediate assets ready, in this case, useful phrases list for these interviews, Q&A strategies, and lots of videos which she's made over the years or which are relevant. And what she emphasizes is this idea of curating rather than creating. Curate is a word you will hear in every L&D talk you ever go to from now on, because that's what the job is becoming. And then the social side, in this case, is mock interview partners. So the English department in the company actually connects people who need to find that partner with the partner. That's the job of L&D. That's not the job of the person to find out. And they have a discussion board online which they can all discuss these project interviews. So you can see the managing of the learning assets is actually quite different to our formal way of thinking this, which was course books and course delivery and all the traditional stuff. Her talk covers a lot of different examples of different types of tasks she needed in her company. This is her, Nadzea Rusak. She's actually the director of language training at EPAM Systems. Very, very experienced in business English. Very, very really switched on lady. But I asked her a couple of questions as well, and this is the sort of thing she answered. Trainers require a lot of support to operate in this sort of environment. Of course, we're not used to it, none of us are. We invest a lot in teacher training. It's continuous learning with feedback and knowledge sharing from inside the company. Our own experts, such as HR, project managers, or account managers, help teachers adapt the content to the corporate context. So this is very different to Duncan and Cassia, who said, okay, people either arrive with English or they just learn on the way. In EPAM systems, there's a mega system to manage English language learning. And they have their own trainers doing it, and these trainers need a lot of support. Normally when she gets up, I have to stop talking, but she's run away. Nadzea also says, almost all of our trainers are full-time employees. Our strengths are our well-developed learning ecosystem and corporate learning culture. She said, we can't really do it with trainers who come in for 1 hour at a time and they don't really know our company. It's all about having people inside the company becoming real experts. And certainly that was the case when I worked at Siemens. We had 100-odd fully employed, pretty much, trainers working inside the company. And we were part of the company. Some of us were employed, some of us were not employed, but that's the game in these big multinationals. Every multinational in the world, pretty much, has or had in-house trainers. It's a huge part of the ELT business. We develop our content based on our own case studies and what we know about the company. Only a few employees take general English. Most of them learn IT or business English for IT, so they're specific to the company. And then she says, she admits this, she says the language training service, which she runs, is fortunate to be part of L&D because we have access to corporate training resources, instructional designers, our own production studio, and the content development center. We can leverage what the company has. So you've got to be inside to be able to do this sort of stuff, offer this sort of stuff. This is Singi Choi, Dr. Singi Choi. She's in Korea. This is one of the people I work with on VTS. A real expert in maritime English, this lady. But she said to me quite interestingly, she said language training will become more specific. She's focused on this very specific anyway. Because general English, there are millions of videos on YouTube for general English, but there is no one who can teach VTS English for Busan port, or for Incheon port, or for Masan port. These are ports in Korea. With AI, of course we always talk about AI nowadays, that kind of specific area of teaching can survive. So she sees her using AI completely, but for her, other areas like general English classroom will die. She didn't say may die, interestingly. This is Cassia again, remember, from Electrolux, and she also knows about these learning clusters. And I asked her, I went back to her and I said, look, what about LCD model? And she said, well, to be truly applicable, we'd need L&D to surround learners with meaningful assets and keep upgrading them and track the learning results. We can claim that life does it day to day, but does this really mean that English is taught in the OK LCD model? So, she's an expert in this area. But it's all new, it's all trending, it's all happening. She's not fully convinced yet either. This is just where training in companies is going in many places, and where professional language trainers in companies are saying, hey, we need to experiment with managing these assets surrounding our learners. So it's all about informal learning. If we look at, this book is really interesting, Dressman, it came out a couple of years ago, Dressman and Sadler, Wiley, and it's all about informal learning in language teaching. New opportunities for language learning are challenging relations between what used to be considered the unavoidable work of mastering another language and what learners often experience as the joyful play of interacting with others. This book is really well worth looking through. It'll change your ideas about how we teach English. The evidence suggests that the entire edifice of language education around the world today could be in jeopardy. HR is saying the same thing. This is an HI guy. The formal-informal learning distinction needs to be retired. HRD should be oriented towards designing and providing all manner of structured learning experiences. What is needed is a catalogue of the full variety of potential learning contexts. People are moving away from formal learning and classrooms and planning courses and all this sort of stuff, It's all about learner experience, structuring and giving them learner experiences. This is Rob. Some of us in BSIG know Rob. He's a member of BSIG. He's a vice president of a really very switched-on company, which it's a language school, but a lot of it is online, delivering intercultural and language training. And for him, this is one of the key points. We can tell a story about KPIs, key performance indicators, and impact. We speak the client's language. We don't talk about proficiency and all these ELT words, CFR, levels, B1, B2. That's not what it's about. As far as return on investment goes, we get the learners to self-report. It's not testing. We survey the line managers, which means we can then show the client the benefits of the training. Measuring how long courses take, who attended, etc., is largely irrelevant in his experience. These are effort indicators, not outcome indicators. So he's representing one of the language schools which is making the change into this new way of thinking about workplace learning. Well, I think this is probably the last big quote. Classroom training was very good at replicating real-life conversations, But now, for many people, most work conversations are online, computer-mediated, so it makes sense that we teach using the same technology. Trainers need to be aware of the fact that work is changing, communication is different. So the lessons need to be different. Teams just emerge, and he's talking about his own teams. Like for a project, they're more agile. In my life, I have new counterparts all the time. Different location, different culture, different way of doing things. We're constantly adapting. So he's not even talking about teaching English. He's saying him as a vice president, he doesn't know who he's going to have meetings with tomorrow and which country they come from. So this is where we are. This is, I think, a summary really of where traditional is moving to new. We're moving away from English course as a main resource to English course just one of many resources. We're moving away from the English teacher as the expert to English teacher as one of many experts. L&D, learning and development, the school, the teacher used to be in control. Now not so much. The learner is in much more control in companies. We used to think about it in terms of language proficiency. In companies, you're talking about performance on the job. Learning evaluated out of context. You get a test, and it has nothing to do with your context. Now, learning evaluated in context. Think about what Rob says about ROI and how people self-report. We always think of learners in lockstep. They come in groups, don't they, and sit in our chairs, and then they move to the next class, and they do it in 40 or 50-minute slots. You know, companies are moving to personalized. We used to push. We write a course and push it to them. Now they pull it. It's on demand. Technology over the last 20 years was an add-on. Now it's pretty much mainstream. You can't think about language learning without technology. We talked about LMSs, learning management systems. Now we're talking about learning content management systems, so curating all these assets. And the content is not, it used to be created, but much more curated now. So what? Where does this leave us? And some of us may recognize these two. I've only got 3 more points, and then we can go and have coffee, don't worry. To remain relevant, I think we need to learn a lot more about how people in the workplace learn languages. Can you think of how many articles you've read about what's happening in the workplace and how people are doing this, all this informal learning that's going on? You can count them on one hand. You know, we are not researching this, and yet it's a massive part of where we should be focused on. You know, this is what most of us are training our teachers, our students to learn English so that they can use it in their lives. This is Helen Best-Turkman, a big name in ESP, very switched-on lady, and in a recent article, and I just happened to find this at the end, there is a need for research of naturalistic learning of specific purpose language, how specific purpose languages are acquired in real-world settings, brackets, not in ESP classrooms. We are brilliant at researching our own little contexts. Thousands of PhDs are done on how my students learned English, you know. But that's not where most people are in the world. That's where most of us are in the world, sadly. Second point, I think to remain relevant, we really need to think about how we do our teacher training, education, and development. This is a cover from a program in South Korea a couple of years ago, Maritime. People came from various parts of Asia, all congregated on one port. The course included going out on a vessel, speaking to the people at sea. It talked about all the specific language they needed. They got a chance to practice on the radios. You know, in the maritime context, and there's conferences like this just for maritime English, maybe not this big. You know, the word is marinating teachers. You put teachers into this thing and they become experts on that area. And of course, in any workplace training, in any ESP context, that's what ESP is. If you're not in a university, if you're in the workplace, you become part of that context. And we've seen that with various quotes today. So marinating teachers, I think, is quite an interesting thing. We need to change how we do this. You know, I run quite a lot of business English courses. And in Taiwan years ago, the business English teachers course was take people to a company, sit down with the in-house trainer, watch lessons, discuss the lessons, all this sort of stuff. You try finding a how to be a business English teacher course now where you actually get to go inside companies and watch things. You know, we're almost going backwards. We sit in our own little world and don't think too much about the real end user, as it were. Last one. I have to talk about ChatGTP, don't I? To remain relevant, we need to learn to use the new technologies. That man overboard script I showed you was a real one. I wanted to play with this. I typed that rubric, write a conversation between a vessel and a VTS reporting man overboard, use standard marine communication phraseology, press button, out comes a conversation, regenerate another one. And you can get 8, 10, 20, as many as you want. They're all slightly different. You might, if you have time, go to an expert VTS operator and say, would you say this? But actually, because it's not so prescribed, almost any of these conversations are good, and they're fantastic resources in the classroom. Now, I mentioned I was involved in writing some course books. You know, to write these sorts of scripts would take days. This takes seconds, literally seconds. It's not even minutes. Once you've written the rubric and press, you've got your very specific content for your classroom. This is how workplace language learning is going. Course books, I think, are going to be struggling against this because every teacher can produce things exactly at the moment. You remember on demand? Pull instead of push? It's not going to be somebody who's never been in your country writing a course book which you use. In a few years' time, it's going to be all of us doing this, I think. So, that brings me to the end of this talk. I hope it was of interest to you. And all I can say is, I wish you a very good conference. Enjoy IATEFL. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Evan. Thank you for representing us finally in the world of ESP and Business English. I come from the world of ESP and Business English. If you are interested in the area of workplace English, then there is a Q&A session later this afternoon with Evan at 10 to 3 in the Queen's Suite 8. Okay, so before you all leave, I need to ask you, please, very kindly, not to leave.